Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are. It's a pleasure to introduce and welcome Professor Martin Uribe. Is that pronunciation okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, Martin Uribe to the Winter School. Professor Uribe is a professor of economics at Columbia University and a research associate of the NBER. Before joining Columbia, Professor Uribe taught at Duke University and the University of Pennsylvania. He obtained a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, and his earlier training was in Argentina. He has made contributions in the areas of international economics, monetary economics, and public finance. His research focuses on understanding the sources and propagation of macroeconomic shocks within and across countries, and on the design of monetary, fiscal, and exchange rate-based stabilization policies. His work has been published in the leading journals of the field, including the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, and Econometrica. He has co-authored, at last count, I think 2 books. Both are on open economy macroeconomics. He has held numerous visiting research positions at various research positions at various central banks, international organizations, and various prestigious universities. Not surprisingly, he works actively for the profession in editorial roles with various leading journals. But let me not hog all the time. Let me again virtually welcome Professor Uribe to Delhi, and I look forward to his talks at the Winter School. Before I let Professor Uribe start, let me just recommend to everyone that please mute your mics and turn off the cameras just to save on bandwidth. And questions, if you have any, can be typed in the Q&A box, and they will be dutifully relayed to Professor Uribe by Dibyendu. Professor Uribe.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's a pleasure to be here in Delhi via this virtual medium. Hopefully one day it's going to again be normal and we could do it in person. It's a pleasure to be at the Winter School at the Delhi School of Economics. This plenary lectures organized jointly by the Delhi School of Economics and the Econometric Society. It's a pleasure also for me to be again in India, if by Zoom this time. I've been there a few years ago and I enjoyed the country very much. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna give the introduction and then maybe I will continue just with the slides because my the sound has been breaking lately, and to not to run that risk, I will at some point maybe put the photo there. But the plan that I have for these 3 lectures are to do a combination of open economy macroeconomics and straight monetary economics. These 3 lectures are going to be on the first one, on which is this one, on downward nominal wage rigidity, exchange rates, and unemployment. The next one, which is going to be tomorrow at this time, is going to be on monetary economics, and I will focus on a topic that is has come to be known as the Near-Fisher effect, which has to do with how countries can lift themselves out of low inflation or how to reduce high inflation in credible ways. And the third is I'm going to go back to open economy, macroeconomics, but this time on thinking of a real setting and talk about something that is important for open economies, which is the so-called super commodity cycle or super commodity price cycle. Okay, so let me start with the lecture today, which is going to be about downward nominal wage rigidity, unemployment and exchange rates. And so let me here here see if I can improve the sound. By maybe putting a photo there. So let me summarize the topic of this lecture, which I think is pretty well captured by what happened in the last great recession that had the last great recession, non-pandemic, I would say, non-pandemic great recession that the world has experienced. And especially how it affected the periphery of Europe, because I think that example is a poster case of how a recession that is large in magnitude affects emerging countries like India, Argentina, or in this case, the periphery of Europe. So what happened in the periphery of Europe is the following. This graph here is an average of all the peripheral countries in Europe. So here we are thinking about countries like Spain, Portugal, Greece, Ireland, etc. And what happened was the following. It's a long story, but I'm going to tell it to you in a nutshell. Europe all countries joined the Eurozone in Western Europe in 1989. And what happened with the peripheral countries was that they experienced an enormous boom. So essentially, what happens was that one story that is often heard is that the rest of the world thought that the periphery of Europe that was relatively poor at the time would converge quickly to the core countries. So what happened was that the entire world started lending to the periphery of Europe enormous amounts of money. So this is reflected here in a huge negative turn in the current account. So when the current account is negative, remember the current account is how much a country borrows each year. So the current account going down like this means that these countries were receiving enormous amounts of capital flows that people were hoping would go quickly to making these countries converge to core countries in Europe like Germany or France. That enormous amount of capital flowing into this region generated a boom in expenditure, in consumption, in investment somehow, and that pushed nominal wages up. So this is an index of the hourly wage. And as you can see, this index increased by about 60% in less than 8 years. So in a region in which inflation was very low. So this is a huge increase in nominal and real wages here. And of course, this boom was also correlated or took place in the context of a sharp drop in unemployment. So this is the unemployment rate. You can see here that unemployment fell sharply during these years. And then came the global financial crisis in 2008, which basically, for these emerging countries, these peripheral countries of Europe, what it meant was essentially that the rest of the world said, we are not going to lend you a penny more. So basically what happened was a vertical reversal. This has a special name in open economy macro, which is a reversal in the current account. This vertical reversal in the current account, which went from very large negative numbers to very close to zero, values even higher than the ones they had at the inception of the euro. So a very sharp reversal in the current account, meaning that the rest of the world didn't want to lend these countries anymore. Non-surprising, what was happening as soon as they stopped receiving these funds is that aggregate demand froze, investment collapsed, consumption froze also. And what happened was an enormous increase in involuntary unemployment. So you see here the increase in unemployment, a very sharp increase in unemployment. A lot of people, millions of people out looking for jobs and not being able to find them, or working fewer hours that they would like at the going wage and not finding more hours to work. Now the question is, what happened with wages? Remember, these countries are all on the euro, so they couldn't devalue their currencies. So what happened with nominal wages in response to this enormous increase in unemployment? Well, wages not only didn't fall, they remained at that same level they had at the peak of the boom, and in some cases even increased a little bit. So the question is, how can we explain all of these things at the same time? The way we are going to do it today is by assuming, that's going to be the main assumption in this lecture, that wages are nominally rigid in the downward direction. So that the economy has downward nominal wage rigidity. And as a motivation, I'm going to take this graph, but I will later suggest to you that downward nominal wage rigidity is a widespread phenomenon that happens not only in these European countries, but also in developed countries, in highly developing countries. So I will have an example from India, for example, informal markets in India, and in emerging countries as well. So it's a phenomenon that has happened across time, across space, and across levels of development. So we are going to take that assumption seriously and see how far it can take us. Now, this is an average of Europe. If you were to disaggregate these countries and go into the different countries that compose that average, you get more or less the same. So this is the same graph, the three graphs, the current account, the index of hourly wages, and unemployment for all the countries. I have another slide where I do the other half of the countries, but I don't want to bother you with that. I just wanted to show you that it's not just the average that looks like that, it's really what is going on in each of these countries, right? Essentially, each of these countries, to some or another extent, experience a huge current account reversal, no adjustment downwardly in wages, and a sharp increase in unemployment when the crisis took place. Okay, so what I want to do now is to develop a model of the open economy that can capture those dynamics and that can help us do quantitative work in this kind of open economies that belong to, say, the medium income or emerging countries. The model is going to be standard in many respects, except that we are going to introduce non-tradable goods and downward nominal wage rigidity. So there will be no surprises here on the consumption side. I'm going to assume that there is a household that maximizes this utility function, the utility function that depends on consumption. Consumption is going to be a composite of tradable and non-tradable goods. And then these households are going to be subject to this sequential budget constraint, where I'm writing on the left side the uses of wealth, so or the uses of income. These households are going to use their income to buy tradable consumption goods. So think about these tradable consumption goods, say, as imported goods. They're going to buy non-tradable consumption goods, right? So these are goods that cannot be traded internationally. Think of this as, you know, the standard example is haircuts, but any personal services, education, healthcare, etc. Everything will be this consumption of non-tradables.
these are different goods, so they will have a relative price. Everything is expressed here in terms of tradable goods, right? So this price, PT, is a relative price of non-tradable goods in terms of tradable goods. It's also sometimes called the real exchange rate because there is a very close relationship between this relative price and how expensive this economy is relative to the rest of the world, right? So this little PT here is the relative price of non-tradable goods in terms of tradable goods. And they're also gonna pay the debt that is due in period T. So this DT is debt coming due in period T. Those are the uses of wealth. The sources of wealth are going to be an endowment of tradable goods. Think about this as, say, if the country is a commodity exporter, is whatever the commodity the country exports. In the case of, say, South American country, it would be grain. In the case of Europe, it would be tourism, for instance, etc. Then these households are going to have labor income. So W is the real wage, and H is the number of hours these guys get to work. They are going to issue more debt. So this debt is the debt coming due in period T+1 and issued in period T. So this is the income they get. This is a discount bond. So the amount, if they issue DT+1 debt coming due tomorrow, the amount of money they really get is that discounted by the interest rate RT, right? So this is standard discount bond. And then they have this profit income. These guys, these households are gonna be the owners of the firms, so they're going to get this profit income. Now, this economy is gonna be non-standard in the following sense. This is going to be a non-variation economy in the sense that I will assume that these guys offer to the labor market every period H bar hours of work inelastically. So they really are willing to work these H bar hours. But when they go on the labor market, sometimes the labor market is weak and they cannot work as many hours as they want to. So they just take the number of hours that the market gives them, right? So they just, when the market is weak, they just take whatever hours exogenously. They have to exogenously take whatever number of hours the market wants to give them. So from their point of view, this HT is exogenously given, right? They just take whatever the market gives them. But this, of course, is HT in equilibrium is an endogenous variable. Now, from the point of view of the household, they take this HT as given. Okay, so that is the non-variation nature of this economy. I'm gonna go quickly through the first order conditions of this household just so that we are all on the same page. And I do it simply because this is a very simple economy and we can be all on the same page. This first equation here is the first order condition with respect to consumption of tradables divided by the first order condition with respect to non-tradables. And it basically says that the price, the relative price of non-tradables in terms of tradables has to be equal to the marginal rate of substitution. Remember, this is the aggregator function of tradables and non-tradables. So this is the marginal rate of substitution between tradables and non-tradables in consumption, right? This is a very important equation. It's actually more important than any of these equations in this model. So I'm gonna expand on the interpretation of this equation in the next slide. The rest is very simple, is the standard growth model, right? This lambda is the marginal utility of consumption of tradables. It's just the marginal utility of consumption multiplied by the marginal utility of tradables. This is a standard Euler equation that says that the marginal utility is equal to the marginal utility tomorrow multiplied by the interest rate and discounted one period, standard Euler equation. And this is the budget constraint, which I repeat again. Remember that the budget constraint is also a first order condition, right? you have to think of the budget constraint as the derivative of the Lagrangian with respect to the Lagrange multiplier itself. So the budget constraint is one of the optimality conditions of the household. So this is a standard open
Martin,
economy. Yes.
Could I ask a question, quick clarificatory
Sure,
question?
sure. Yes,
So in
yes.
in the budget constraint, you have a real wage rate. So the real wage rate is defined necessarily in terms of the tradable, right? So
Yes.
because so why is that? So is there, because otherwise probably the exchange rate would enter into the right hand side of your budget equation as well, right? So why?
I could have expressed the budget constraint in any numeraire. That is immaterial. So I could have expressed everything in terms of non-tradables, or I chose to do it in terms of tradables, right? But you're right. If I had expressed everything in terms of non-tradables, I would have had here this multiplied by 1 over PT, right? This would be multiplied by 1 over PT. This debt is expressed in terms of tradables. Think of this as being, if you're in India, this DT would be in dollars, for instance. So this would also be divided by PT. But what numeraire you use is immaterial, right?
No,
So,
so the reason, maybe I'm anticipating something, but the reason why I ask is that you motivated by saying nominal rigidity, wage rigidity, but nominal in terms of what? In terms of the price of the tradable or non-tradable?
no.
So that's
Wage really, wait, I haven't been there yet.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right, fine.
you're
I'll
just
wait.
like, but just to anticipate what I'm gonna do here, I'm motivated by this graph, right? By this
Yes.
here.
Yes.
So what this is suggesting is that wages didn't adjust downwardly. So I'm gonna today explore how far we can go, assuming that wages are downwardly rigid.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
All right. I'll wait for your explanation.
Okay. Thank you. So let me expand on this equation here. So this is the standard micro 101 that says that households consume two goods until the marginal rate of substitution between the two goods equals the price. Now, this, if you hold constant consumption of tradables, the desired consumption of tradables, think about holding this desired consumption of tradables constant, then what this defines is a demand for non-tradables. If the price of non-tradables, the relative price of non-tradables goes up, if this right-hand side goes up, these guys are going to consume less non-tradables. And you can see that because this A2 is decreasing in the second argument. If this function is concave, this is going to be decreasing in the second argument. And A1, the first derivative with respect to the first argument, is increasing in the second argument. So this left-hand side is decreasing in consumption of non-tradables. So what this says is that holding consumption of tradables constant, when the relative price of non-tradable goes up, households demand less non-tradables. Now, of course, I will hold consumption of tradables constant, but this consumption of tradables will have to be is an endogenous variable, so it will have to be determined endogenously. But for the sake of analysis right now, I'm going to hold consumption of tradables constant and look at this equation as a demand for non-tradables. So when the relative price of non-tradable goes up, households demand a smaller quantity of non-tradable goods. And consumption of tradables acts here as a shifter of this demand schedule. When the desire of consumption of tradables goes up, this entire demand schedule shifts up and to the right. Okay? So think about consumption of tradables. We are going to deduce it formally in a couple of slides, but think about consumption of tradables goods as determined, say, by the stream of endowment of tradable goods. Say, if you're an oil producer country, by the stream of oil extraction, if you're a producer of some commodity or some manufactured commodity, would be the endowments of those commodities. And so consumption of tradable will go up or down, for instance, with the with the world interest rate, with the endowment of the commodity, etc. So an increase in a fall in the world interest rate, for instance, would increase consumption of tradables and will push this demand out and to the right. Okay, so this is a standard demand function for non-tradable goods. How does the supply of non-tradable goods look like in this model? Well, for that, we need to go again, as we do in Econ 101, we need to go to the firms. And I'm going to assume that this non-traded good is very intensive in labor. I'm gonna go all the way to the extreme by assuming that the non-traded good is produced with labor only, with this production function F. So the profits of the firm are going to be the output of the non-traded good multiplied by the price. So this would be revenue measured in terms of tradable goods minus the labor cost. And the labor cost is the real wage multiplied by the amount of employment or the demand for labor by this firm. Now, why am I saying that this is the nominal wage? So this is the nominal wage, say in rupees, and this is the exchange rate. So this would be rupees per dollar. Now, why do I say that this is a real wage? Well, I'm going to make two assumptions that are going to simplify the analysis. One is going to be that the law of one price holds for tradable goods. Okay, so I'm going to assume that the price in rupees of the tradable good is equal to the price in rupees or in dollars of the tradable good in world markets multiplied by the exchange rate. Right? So this is rupees per dollar. This is the price of the good in dollars. So once I multiply these two variables, I get a price in rupees. And I'm going to assume that the domestic price of the tradable good, the good that can be traded internationally, is equal to the world price expressed in rupees. And then I'm going to assume for simplicity that the dollar price of the traded good is constant in dollars, right? So I'm going to think of an economy that is, in which, or a period in which the dollar price of the tradable good is fixed at 1. So in that case, PT becomes this ET, which is the nominal exchange rate. So here, what I'm doing really is dividing the wage rate in rupees by the price of the tradable good, right? Or the exchange rate, which is the same thing. So this is the real wage expressed in terms of tradable goods. Okay, so these are real profits. Of course, the first order condition is to take the derivative with respect to hours. We do that, and what you get is that these firms are going to equate P to this expression here, which is the marginal cost, right? So the numerator is the real wage, and the denominator is the marginal product of labor. So this right-hand side is the marginal cost. So this expression says that the price has to be equal to the marginal cost. These are competitive firms, so that is what they do. Now, what does this marginal cost look like? What does this supply? We can think of this as the supply of non-tradable goods. Well, the marginal, this is a concave function, so the marginal product is decreasing in hours. So when these firms increase employment, the marginal product goes down, so this right-hand side goes up. So this function looks like this. The higher is the price, the more goods these firms want to produce, and for that they need to demand more labor, and they produce more quantities of goods, right? So it's a supply schedule of this type, and this supply schedule will shift whenever either the wage rate goes up or the exchange rate depreciates, right? If the rupee price of a dollar goes up, that is to say the rupee depreciates vis-a-vis the dollar, then the real wage goes down and the supply schedule shifts to the right. But if the rupee appreciates, that is to say, if the number of rupees you need to pay per unit of dollar goes down, the real wage cost for firm goes up, and this supply schedule shifts up and to the left. The same if the wage were to change, holding the rupee exchange rate, the rupee dollar exchange rate constant. If the wage increases, there's an increasing cost for firms, so this supply schedule will shift again up and to the left. Okay, so these are the two shifters of the supply schedule, the nominal wage and the rupee dollar exchange rate, or the nominal exchange rate. Okay, so now we have supply and demand. We want to put them together, but there is a problem, and that is the question that you asked. What is going to interfere in this economy from supply and demand to be equal to each other at full employment? Well, we are going to assume that there is downward nominal wage rigidity inspired by that graph that I showed you at the beginning of this lecture. And we are going to model downward nominal wage rigidity in a very simple way. We are going to assume that the nominal wage in period T cannot be larger than a fraction gamma of the wage in period T minus 1. So for instance, if gamma is 1, then what we are saying is that the wage rate today cannot be lower than the wage rate yesterday. Now, why is that? Is something that we don't yet fully understand. But it's something that we see in the data. There's a professor at Yale University, a senior professor called Truman Bewley, who was very puzzled about that question in the US, because he was observing the 1992 recession in the US, and he saw unemployment going up and wages not falling. And he said, why is that? Why is it that nominal wages don't fall in the context of high unemployment? So what he did is he took a tape recorder and decided to interview managers, CEOs, and human resource representatives of firms, medium-sized and large firms in the northeast of the United States. So he's at Yale, so he basically got into his car and started going around with his tape recorder. And every time he met with a CEO or a HR representative, he did the following, because he didn't want to bias anybody. So he said, why is it that you don't cut wages during recessions? And he pressed play and listened to what they have to say and recorded it. He wrote the book with everything that the guy said without changing the comma. So if you buy that book and you read it, it reads a little bit like James Joyce's Ulysses, right? It's like a stream of conscience, because he didn't want to change anything of what the guy said. So the guy could sometimes change topic and so on, but the gist of what you get from those interviews is that managers don't want to change wages, because changing wages would change the morale in the company. So what they basically say is, if I cannot meet with my employee at the end of the year and say, look, this year you did great, so I will cut your wage. They get very mad. So instead of cutting wages, I prefer to just fire people. And when they are asked, they ask themselves, why am I happy firing people or laying people off? The answer they give is because firing someone also lowers the morale of that person, but he's at home. He's no longer in my firm. So it doesn't affect the productivity in my work. So that is the choice that they face. They think that cutting wages makes workers mad, and that lowers the morale, that lowers the productivity. So they prefer to instead fire people. That is one, if you want, very direct piece of evidence. I will give you more evidence on this later on. But that is an introduction to why this is not an unreasonable way to model downward nominal wage rigidity. We are going to also, of course, impose that these guys cannot work, they cannot be forced to work more hours than the hours they supply. So HT is going to be restricted to be less than or equal to H bar. And then I'm going to impose this slackness condition here that says, this slackness condition says the following. If in any period there is an employment, that is to say, households or workers are working fewer hours than they would like to, there is involuntary unemployment here, that has to be a period in which the wage is stuck at this lower bound. That is to say, that has to be a period in which WT is exactly equal to WT minus 1 times gamma. So if there is an employment, the wage has to be stuck at the lower bound. And if this is a period in which the wage is not stuck at the lower bound, that is to say, it's a period in which for some reason there is a boom or whatever, the wage is above gamma times WT minus 1, that has to be a period in which there is full employment. That is to say, in which HT is equal to H bar. Okay, so I'm going to impose that slackness condition, which ensures that there is an employment only when the wage is stuck at the lower bound, and that if the market wage is above the lower bound, that has to be a period in which no one has a problem finding a job. Okay, so that's the discipline I'm going to impose in this model. What I do here is, since we are using everything expressed in terms of tradables, I'm just dividing here by the nominal exchange rate to get these expressions here. So you divide by the nominal exchange rate, you get the real wage here. Here you divide by the same thing. So if you want to get, you cannot divide by epsilon t and get the real wage yesterday. So you have to divide by ET minus 1. So what you get here is the real wage divided by this epsilon t, which is the depreciation rate. So this is the growth rate of the nominal wage. Okay, so this is just expressing these equations in real terms. Okay, so there's nothing new here relative to here. Okay, the only new definition here is this variable epsilon, which is the growth rate of the nominal exchange rate, the depreciation rate, or the devaluation rate, however you want to call it. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to cut in. I have no problem. I welcome any questions you might have. Okay. Any questions at this point? We finished deriving the demand for non-tradables, the supply of non-tradables. We introduced downward nominal wage rigidity. Now we have to say how markets clear. Well, obviously here markets are not clearing period by period, right? You have this, instead of having the market clearing condition, which would say H is equal to H bar every period, you have this expression here. Okay. The market for goods, though, does clear. So in the market for non-tradables, the demand for non-tradables has to be equal to the supply of non-tradables, right? So consumption of non-tradables has to be equal to production of non-tradables. That is what defines a non-traded good, right? So this is the market for non-tradables clearing period by period. Okay, so now that we have the building blocks of the model, let's see how a currency peg works. And by a currency peg, I mean either the situation that the periphery of Europe was going through, where they were in this currency union, so they couldn't devalue the euro. They had to be stuck to the euro they say Spain couldn't devalue vis-a-vis Germany. They had to stick to this one-to-one relationship between the price of the currency in Germany and the price of the currency in Spain, which is the same currency, so that exchange rate is one. And I'm going to call that the currency peg. But the analysis we are going to do here applies to any other exchange rate regime in which the country manages the exchange rate, right? In which the exchange rate is not fully floating, but the government is setting some path for the exchange rate, like a crawling peg or some table describing what is going to be the time path of the exchange rate, not just to currency pegs. But currency peg is a good benchmark for analytical purposes. Okay, so we described what was the demand schedule, the supply schedule, and what I want to analyze now is what would a boom-bust cycle look like in a currency peg. So what I want to do now is to look at that graph we saw about Europe, that boom-bust cycle in Europe, through the lens of this model. So I'm going to assume that we start here at point A, where there is full employment, and all of a sudden, the rest of the world becomes very optimistic about this country. For instance, suppose that they lower the interest rate, so everybody starts consuming and expanding consumption. So this demand schedule shifts up and to the right. And the question is, what's going to be the equilibrium? Well, if the supply schedule stayed put, didn't change, the economy would go to point B. Now, the problem with point B is that it's not feasible, because at point B, employment would be larger than H bar. So that cannot be. Workers cannot work more than H bar. So at this point, there will be excess demand for labor. Sorry. There will be excess demand for labor. The wage is going to begin to be pushed up because there is excess demand for labor. Now, the wage rate is not rigid upwardly. So the wage rate can easily increase. As the wage increases, the supply schedule will start shifting up and to the left. And the new equilibrium is going to be here at point C. Okay, at that point, supply and demand are equal to each other. There is no excess demand or excess supply of labor. So the economy is in equilibrium right there. So what this boom produces is an increase in wages like we saw in Europe. Okay, so now this is the period in Europe from the beginning of the Eurozone, say 1999, until the very beginning of the global financial crisis. When the global financial crisis comes, the rest of the world tells Europe, we are not going to lend you a penny more. We are going to increase the interest rate on you, and the interest rate goes up, everybody consumes less, and let's assume that that pushes the demand schedule back down to its original position. So the demand schedule here, sorry, the demand schedule now shifts down to its original position. Well, where is the equilibrium going to be? Well, if the authority is fixing the exchange rate, so the exchange rate doesn't change, and the wage rate is downwardly rigid, then neither W nor E are going to change. And as a result, this real wage is going to stay put, it's going to stay fixed. So the new equilibrium is going to be along this new supply schedule. The economy is going to go to point D. Now, the problem at point D is that there is unemployment. People want to work, but they don't find a job. Why? Because the real wage is too high. The real wage doesn't adjust downwardly for two reasons. First, because the nominal wage is downwardly rigid, and second, because the authority is fixing the exchange rate. So the real wage stays there and the economy goes to point D. Now, the problem with point D is that not only there is unemployment, but that unemployment can be chronic, can become protracted to the extent that wages fall slowly over time. Over time, as wages start falling slowly, the economy is going to start, this supply schedule is going to start shifting down and to the right because the wage is starting to fall, and the economy will eventually go back to point A, but that might take years. In fact, in Europe, wages didn't move much 5 years out into the Great Contraction. So that can happen very, very slowly. So the economy is likely to be stuck in a point like this for many years. So in the context of a recession like this, having the exchange rate fixed can be very dangerous. That is what this model is telling us, right? So of course, every prediction we get depends on the model we write. In this model, this situation is there to stay for a long period of time. Now, there are two additional things I want you to see. The first one is that there is this asymmetric adjustment in the way up and in the way down, right? In the way up, the economy is in full employment and wages adjust upwardly. In the way down, wages don't adjust and the economy goes into recession. So you have full employment during booms, recession during contractions. Unemployment during contraction. Full employment during booms, unemployment during contraction. So on average, over the business cycle, this economy has positive unemployment because it has full employment during booms and unemployment during contractions. So zero unemployment during booms, positive unemployment during contractions. So the average level of unemployment is positive. Moreover, if these up and downs, this business cycle were more volatile, then the unemployment you would get in the recession would be higher. So that means that an increase in the volatility of the business cycle, what it makes is it increases the average unemployment rate in the economy. So the average unemployment rate depends on the amplitude of the business cycle. The more volatile is the business cycle, the more up and downs the economy has, the larger is going to be the average unemployment rate. What this means is that a second moment, which is the volatility of the business cycle, affects a first moment, which is the average rate of unemployment. So you can see here how different the cost of unemployment is in this economy from, say, the economy of Lucas. So Lucas's big result in the late 80s was that the cost of business cycle is basically nothing. And the way he justified that with his calculations was to say, well, the average level of consumption in the economy is independent of the business cycle, right? It has to do with education, trend, and so on, demographics, and so on. So it's independent of the business cycle. And so the cost of the business cycle is just the volatility of consumption times the curvature of the utility function. So he got that it's basically nothing. Well, in this model, the average level of consumption depends on the volatility of the business cycle, because whenever there is unemployment, these are workers that are not producing non-tradable goods. So they're consuming a smaller quantity of non-tradable goods. And we just deduce that the higher is the amplitude of the business cycle, the higher is the level, the average level of unemployment. And as a result, the lower is going to be the average level of consumption. Now, when you lower the average level of consumption, welfare is affected in a first order degree. So here you have a second order variable, say the shock, the variance of the shock driving the business cycle here, generating a first order negative effect on the average level of unemployment, and as a result on the average level of consumption, that can have a large effect on welfare. So this model, unlike the calculations that Lucas proposed to us in the late 80s, has a potential for business cycles having a large impact on welfare. I will not have time to do quantitative analysis with this model today, but if you continue reading the slides after the class, that analysis is performed in the context of this model. The other thing that is apparent from this graph is that a boom, which typically we say is a good thing, in this model, a boom is the prelude of very bad things to happen in the future. That is to say, a boom is nice, it brings you from here to here, it increases the real wage, it makes people happier. But when the economy goes back to normal, that normal is not the same normal as before. It's a different normal in which you have unemployment. So the problem with this situation is the following, is that it creates an externality. That is to say, when the economy receives a good shock, say a fall in the interest rate that shifts consumption of tradables up and shift the demand schedule up, everybody consumes more, and everybody knows that that is going to push wages up and it's going to take us to this position. And everybody knows also that that increasing wages is trouble for the future. It's going to, that high wages are going to imply unemployment when the economy goes back to normal. Everybody knows that. The household knows it, the firm knows it, the workers know it, but they can do nothing about it because they are atomistic agents. They see demand going up and they say, oh, this is going to generate problems in the future, but there's nothing they can do. Even though it is their own consumption, their own individual consumption that when you collect them all together is creating these increasing wages. So this economy has what can be called a currency peg externality. When there is downward nominal wage rigidity and you have a currency peg, this economy has this externality that people do not internalize the fact that when wages go up during a boom, has a negative aspect for the economy, which is that when the economy goes back to normal, there will be unemployment. That externality gives rise to policies or the optimality of policies such as capital controls. So in this economy, if the economy is going to keep the currency peg, it is optimal to come up with fiscal instruments to counteract this. And one of the fiscal instruments that could work here, and I show this in the context of this model, but I won't be able to go over this here, is that in this economy, it is optimal for the government to introduce capital controls, but not during the recession, during the boom. That is to say, when the economy goes from here to here, what the economy could do is, the government could do is to impose capital controls to say to these people, look, don't borrow so much. Don't borrow like the periphery of Europe borrowed between 2000 and 2008. Just borrow a little bit less. Go have a party, but have a party that will stay half the way until here only, so that when the economy goes back to normal, you don't generate a huge unemployment problem. You can generate a smaller unemployment problem. So the economy goes to a region here, so that then that problem can be fixed in a shorter period of time. Okay, so in this economy, capital control policy is indeed optimal. So what are the takeaways of this adjustment under a currency peg when wages are downwardly rigid? First, booms are the prelude of unemployment, okay? Because this economy adjusts asymmetrically. You don't go back to the same normal, you go back to a certain different normal. The more volatile is the business cycle, the higher is the average rate of unemployment. So volatility affects the first moment. Volatility affects the average, right? So this is the second moment affecting the first moment. And the third takeaway is that this economy, when you have nominal rigidity and you have then a government that fixes a price, in this case, the price of a dollar in terms of rupees, a fixed exchange rate, the economy has this externality, you can call it a currency peg externality, where people don't take into account the fact that it's their own expenditure during the boom that is then responsible for the unemployment when the economy goes back to normal. The fact that they don't internalize that calls for government intervention in the form, for instance, of capital controls, but not during the recession, capital controls during the boom. So those are called, as you know, macroprudential interventions, right? So this would be macroprudential capital control policy. Okay, any questions about this? Okay, so we're running a little bit behind. So let me go a little bit faster here. I'm going to skip this analysis that is more mathematical in nature, and just to give you a flavor of what is going on. What would happen if, so this is, for instance, a concrete example of what kind of a shock can hit this economy. Suppose that the economy is hit by a positive shock, a fall in the interest rate. So the interest rate is constant at this level. The interest rate falls in one period and then goes back to the same level as before, right? So this would be a good shock in the sense that there is a fall in the world interest rate. So the country borrowing conditions get easier in this period, and then they go back, but they go back to the same level that they had before. Okay, so this is in some sense a positive shock. What happens with consumption in this economy? Well, households are going to consume more when the shock hits of this tradable endowment. This is consumption of tradables. They consume more of the tradable endowment. Because they consume more of the tradable endowment in this period zero, when the shock goes away and the interest rate goes back to normal, consumption goes back to a flat level, but that flat level is lower than before because they already consume part of the endowment in this period. So the flow of endowment that they have in the future is lower. So you have a boom in consumption, then a flattening of consumption to a level lower than before. Look what happens with debt. What these households do is they have a flat level of debt. In the peak, when the interest rate goes down, they increase debt. And then when the interest rate goes down, they don't pay back their debt. They just keep paying the interest on their debt, and they sustain this new level of debt forever like this. Now, what happens with unemployment? This is the problem with this economy. The economy is in full employment. Let me show you first, this is the real wage. The economy is in full, has this real wage. The real wage goes up during the boom, but then it doesn't go down because the currency is pegged and the government is fixing the nominal exchange rate. So the real wage is flat here at the higher level, but consumption is falling. So demand falling and real wages high implies that unemployment goes up. So this is what this model implies. And this situation, again, as long as these real wages stay high, of course, over time, at some point here, they're going to start to go down, and unemployment is going to disappear. But while these real wages stay high, the economy is going to suffer unemployment. So this is what it means, that a boom is a prelude of higher unemployment in the future. So a boom is the prelude of something bad to happen. Even though the economy, in terms of the interest rate, went back to normal, it's not that this interest rate is higher than this one. This interest rate is the same as this one. Okay. All right. So what happens when the government applies a flexible exchange rate, and in particular, what happens if the government applies it in an optimal fashion? Well, the motivation for thinking about an optimal exchange rate is obviously that by devaluing the currency, what the government can do is to make the economy cheaper, right? So this story that I'm going to tell you is not the story of beggar thy neighbor. It's not that you're devaluing to make your country cheaper than the rest of the world, and the demand from the rest of the world is going to be higher. No, it's not that. It's that by devaluing, you make the real wage lower. By making the real wage lower, you allow the labor market to go back to equilibrium. So this is the idea. Let's start again.
Martin, there
Yes.
are a couple of clarificatory questions. Would you like to take right now?
Yes, go ahead, read it.
So one question's why doesn't farm equation have a random walk component which can help anticipate the rise in wages? This is one.
Sorry,
The second question,
what has a random walk? Which one?
why doesn't farm equation have a random shock component which can help anticipate the rise in wages?
You mean the nominal exchange rate, it says?
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay.
This is one question. I'm just raising questions, a couple of questions, and then we can take now or maybe later.
Yeah.
The other clarificatory questions: how more spending leads to nominal wage go up? And
Right.
the third question is there empirical verification of this model presented? It would seem the concrete shift would depend also on the nature of boom and the dynamics and the distribution of the quantities that derived in. So these are three, I think, the clarificatory questions, I guess. You may respond now or maybe later. Yeah.
Right. Well, with respect to the nominal exchange rate having a random walk, that is precisely what we're going to study now. And second, why the demand schedule, why an increase in demand creates an increase in wages? Well, the reason is that remember, the demand for labor is a derived demand. Firms demand more labor because they want to produce more. So if there is an increase in demand for goods, firms want to respond to that by increasing supply, and in increasing supply, they demand more labor. But in order to be able to attract more labor, they need to push wages up. And once wages go up, the problem is that then they don't go down. That is the point. But we can expand on that later. And the empirical validity of this model, well, I gave you some flavor with the European crisis of 2008. I will give you more evidence on downward nominal wage rigidity now, soon, very soon. And third, there are other countries. For instance, I show in a JPE paper that we published with Stephanie in 2016, we show that this model is validated by the Great Contraction in Argentina in 2001. So there are many aspects of this model that have predictions that can be confronted directly with evidence, and that has been done in different papers. There is a large literature also putting this model to a test. So let me show you now what happens if suppose when the central bank changes the exchange rate. So we start again at point A, and suppose that this was the boom, right? So this was 2008. We are at the boom with high wages here, and 2008 comes, and the rest of the world tells this country, we are not going to lend you at all more. We're going to increase the interest rate. So the demand for tradables falls like this, and the economy goes from point A to point B if the central bank keeps the exchange rate constant. But suppose now that the central bank starts to depreciate the currency, right? So E goes up now. That is going to push the supply schedule down and to the right until the economy, if the evaluation is right, reaches point C. At point C, the economy has reached full employment again, right? If this depreciation happens quickly enough, the economy, in spite of having a negative shock, will not suffer unemployment. Now, this is the point that is very important to understand. This economy is having a recession in the sense that this demand schedule is low. This demand schedule is low for some reason. For instance, because the interest rate went up. So it's not that the devaluation is preventing the economy from having a recession. The economy is having a recession. What the devaluation is achieving in this setting is that the recession doesn't spill over to the non-trade sector. This is the non-trade sector. So this is a recession, say, originating in the trade sector. There's a collapse in the consumption of tradables. But what the devaluation does is prevent that this recession spillovers into the non-trade sector. But it's not preventing the recession itself. The recession itself was caused by some other factor, for instance, a fall in the price of oil, if the country is a producer of oil, or an increase in the world interest rate, or any external factor that causes the demand for tradable goods to fall, and therefore to push this demand schedule down and to the right. Now, if you are an econometrician, not an econometrician, a statistician that knows nothing about economics, what you're going to see is here a depreciation and a recession. So you're going to conclude that devaluations or depreciations are associating with recessions. So your conclusion is going to say, it's going to be that devaluations are bad because they occur when the economy has a low demand for goods, right? But that is because you don't see the unemployment that would have happened if the government had not devalued. You don't see this part. You only see, remember, you're looking at data. And data, this economy went from A to B. So you don't see the unemployment that could have happened without the devaluation. You only see that the economy is in a recession because the demand schedule is down and that the government devalued. So when you run your correlation between depreciation and the level of output, you're going to find that there is a positive correlation between devaluations and recessions. So you're going to say, therefore, we shouldn't devalue. But if you were not to devalue in this economy, you would make things even worse because now this point would occur. So that is why I think when you see someone saying, well, I don't like devaluations, large devaluations, because large devaluations are associated with recessions, the answer to that statement is, well, what you are describing to me is a correlation. You're not telling me what is causing what. In order to understand what is causing what, you need to use a model. You cannot escape that. You don't need to use this model, but you need to use some model. And depending on what model you use, your answer is going to be more or less justified. But the point I'm trying to make is that the mere correlation of recessions with devaluation doesn't say that devaluations are good or bad. It only tells you there is a correlation. In order to say whether these devaluations are good or bad, you need to have a model, okay? Not necessarily this model, any model, but you need to justify your statement with a model. Okay, so I have only a few
Could
minutes.
I ask that clarification,
Yes,
quick
yes.
clarification on this, Martin? So one is that, so question is that, you have taken the interest rate or whatever the behavior of the foreign investor, who are fixing the interest rate as sort of exogenous, right? Could that be related to your devaluation decision? In that case, could there be some apprehension about devaluation because it might, make your credit worthiness even worse or something? That's a different model, of course, but could that be, or can one relate this devaluation decision to some apprehension about even more stringent credit condition?
That is a very good question indeed. Here in this model, to make things simple, I have only one source of inefficiency in this economy, that is downward nominal wage rigidity. So in this model, in some sense, there is nothing bad with devaluations because devaluations bring you to full employment, and that's all you want, right? In this model, you don't want to. These households supply H-bar units of labor, so it's absolutely inefficient to have these guys unemployed here. You want to have them employed. So in this model, devaluations are a win-win proposition. But suppose that we put, along the lines of your question, suppose that we were to put some negative consequences of devaluation. For instance, a devaluation could alter the balance sheet of a firm. For instance, suppose that you have a firm that receives its revenue in rupees, but has to pay inputs in dollars, say machines or some materials that are imported. Well, if you devalue, you can make the financial situation of that firm or the balance sheet of that firm much weaker. And that could generate a fall in labor demand, and that could be contractionary. I don't have time today, of course, to go into that, but there is work that has done that has merged this model with including a financial friction. And then you have two frictions competing, right? The financial friction and this labor friction, which is downward wage rigidity. The devaluation is good to ameliorate or fix the labor market friction, the downward nominal wage rigidity, but it's bad in terms of the financial frictions. And there's a very nice paper by Pablo Otonello that does exactly that. It merges this model with a model of financial frictions. The model he uses is the model of Bianchi of collateral constraints in a small open economy. And he puts the two frictions to compete. And it turns out that the optimal devaluation rate is also pretty high. That is to say, it's optimal during recessions to devalue almost to the point where the economy reaches full employment. And the reason is kind of simple. The reason is that if this country doesn't devalue, remember, and the fixed exchange rate, what you get is over the business cycle is that the average level of employment goes down. That is to say, the average level of consumption goes down. Whereas the collateral constraints, especially in the Bianchi model, what they do is they exacerbate the business cycle. It's not those collateral constraints don't induce a fall in average consumption. And if you think of the Lucas way of computing welfare, volatility doesn't do much to welfare. What does a lot to welfare is the average fall in consumption. So that is why in that model, devaluations continue to be optimal, right? Large devaluations during large recessions. Okay, in the last 10 minutes that I have, unfortunately I have to skip this. I want to go a little bit over how plausible downward nominal wage rigidity is. Let me give you first evidence from developed countries. I'm going to go to the US. This is in the late 80s. And this in the US, there is a very nice survey called SIPP, which is a survey of income and program participation, where they follow people over time. And they ask them several times a year about their employment, their wages, their hourly wages, and a bunch of other questions. And this is a table of what people answer about their wage change from in the interval of 1 year. So this is a yearly wage change. And if you ask how many people had wage declines, only 5% of the people had wage declines. How many people had wage increases? Almost half. And how many people had constant wages, that is to say, neither increase nor fall? About half. So the stylized fact is that half of the people have wage increases and half of the people have wage constancy, that is to say, no change in wages. And a very few percentage of people have a wage decline. That is the same whether you focus on the whole population or females or male.
Martin, is it nominal wage or?
This is the
wage?
nominal hourly wage. Yes.
Okay.
The nominal hourly wage. So this is for the late 80s. Let's go to another period. This is the same data, but these are the weights of surveys that one decade later, which is interesting here because remember, the US economy went through a recession in the late 90s, right? So this is a good period to look at because you would say, okay, if the economy is in a recession, a lot of unemployment, you would see more wages falling. But that is not the case. The distribution is also truncated here to the left. In this graph, the authors didn't plot the constant wages because the constant wages would be over here, would make this graph be out of chart, out of scale. So they chose not to plot the constant wage, but think of the constant wages here as being a very tall tower here, a very tall bar. So the same thing, you find here the same exact thing. So the fact that you have a lot of people stuck at no change suggests wage rigidity. And the fact that those guys who are stuck at zero are all coming from the left, not from the right, suggests that this rigidity is downward rigidity and not upward rigidity. We were then interested, when we looked at this data, we were interested in what happened during the Great Contraction, because The Great Contraction was a contraction much larger than this contraction of the late 90s. So we decided to do this graph for the entire years over and before and after the contraction, say from 1997 to 2016. So the Great Contraction is right in the middle, would be the middle panels. And you see the same picture. All of these distributions are truncated to the left with the peak at 0, okay, which suggests, again, the possibility of downward nominal wage rigidity. Now, this is interesting because this is a highly developed country like the United States. But you might say, okay, one problem with this data is that in the United States, everything is formal, right? Employment is formal. Everybody has to report wages. What happens in economies like Argentina or any emerging country, India as well, in which there is a large informal market? In Argentina, for instance, 30% of employment is informal. It's not in the books. So you could say that, you could think that in those markets, the employers just cut the wages of these guys and much easier than in an economy in which everything's on the books. Well, the answer is that that is not the case. So in order to show you that, I have data also for Argentina, but I chose to show you this data from India that you are gonna, I'm sure, find it more interesting and relate more to. This is a very nice paper by Supreet Kaur, who was at Columbia at the time. This is indeed one of the chapters of her dissertation. And what she did was she collected rainfall data, wage data, and output data from a bunch of districts in India over a number of years, and looked at what happened with wages and employment with rainfall as a function of rainfall. And what she finds is that when the district has a negative rain shock, that is to say, an amount of rain that is insufficient, for instance, what happens is that there is rationing in, and remember, she focuses on informal daily labor markets. So these are markets where in a village, the employer goes to the square, to the main square, and tells people who wants to work. Those who say, I want, they jump on they provide transportation, they jump on the transportation, they go work for a day, and they come back to their houses. So when the rainfall is good, wages go up, there is full employment. And what she finds is that when rainfall is bad, there's insufficient rain, unemployment goes up, but wages fail to fall. That is the result of that paper. Now, the most interesting part, this is quite interesting, but the most interesting part of that story is that Supreet looks at a period that is long enough where India showed changes in the inflation rate. And the interesting thing with that is that rainfall in a particular, the idiosyncratic amount of rainfall in a particular district is uncorrelated. It's pretty safe to assume that that is uncorrelated with the general rate of inflation in the country. So the interesting thing that Supreet found was that in periods of high inflation, those districts that had insufficient rainfall had less unemployment and less rationing in the labor market, which suggests that the downward wage rigidity is in nominal wages and not in real wages. I find that finding very, very interesting. So two important takeaways from Supreet's work. Takeaway number one the fact that the labor market is highly informal. A labor market doesn't get more informal than this. Does not mean that wages are flexible. That is a very important finding, because the typical reaction of people is to say, well, you don't have data. You bring data from an emerging country, but you don't have data on informal wages because informal wages are typically not collected by the statistical agencies. Well, what Supreet shows is that if you go and try to find those wages and look at how they also behave in ways that are, like these ones, right? Even though the market is highly informal. And second, nominal rigidity seems to be in nominal wages and not in real wages. Let me close now with, sometimes people say, well, now the US is like this because now unions are stronger than before. If you were to look at all data, you will see that wages are very flexible. This is data from the Great Contraction. I'm going to close with this graph. Look at this graph. This is a graph of prices during the Great Depression, right? The Great Depression occurred between 1929 and 1933. So look at how prices fell. This is the general price level. Remember, during this period, the unemployment rate in the US was 25%. If you look at how much wages fell by only 8% when the price level was falling by 25%. So real wages in this period were actually going up in a country in which the unemployment rate had gone up to 25%. So every fourth American was unemployed. So this is another piece of data, piece of evidence that suggests downward nominal wage regime. Okay, so let me close because I don't have time by concluding that what we did today was to explore, see how far just one assumption, which is downward nominal wage rigidity, can go in shedding light on this type of dynamics, on explaining how economies can go from booms in which the current account is negative to reversals in the current account and to increases in unemployment in response to external shocks such as an increase in the interest rate, which is what happened here. And how nominal exchange rate devaluations could help ameliorate this problem here. And we also presented evidence suggesting that this thing that we saw here, that wages don't fall, is actually a very widespread phenomenon, not just in these peripheral countries in Europe, but also in highly informal markets, in emerging countries like India, Argentina, and also across time in developed countries like the US, but not only US today, but also US, say, pre-welfare state, right? Pre-Lyndon Johnson and so on. Okay, so I'm going to stop here because my time is up. In case there are questions, I will be happy to entertain.
So we started 5 minutes late, so maybe we can take 3-4 minutes for some questions. I think there are two questions, basically trying to understand that why labor market are not flexible to, let's say, adjusted in the wage process so that the unemployment can be worked out. Why that is the case. This is one. Then second, maybe I want to get a bit of clarification. So when you said that the informal wage is also showing some kind of downward rigidity, maybe they were getting some kind of wages which is hitting to their poverty line. They cannot go lower than that. That could be also the reason, isn't it? I mean,
that they cannot go up, you say?
I mean, if they go down further, they'll starve, isn't it?
Right. 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 So, yeah, I think that in this, well, the question of why these wages don't fall, I
Yeah.
think it's a question that, so that would be your first question. That is a question that is still a subject of investigation, right? So I think there's still a long way to go. What the work of Truman Bewley suggests is that they are really deleterious for productivity, right? So imagine having a model in which productivity depends on whether the nominal wage went down, right? So that would be a reduced form model. So understanding why that is, I think, is an important question to address. And I agree with you in this model. In this model, having downward nominal wage rigidity is more deleterious. It's more welfare costly than having downward and upward nominal rigidity, wage rigidity. So if we were to have in this model more rigidity by including upward rigidity as well, that would be great. It would be better than having just downward nominal wage rigidity. And the question is simple. If in the way up, wages didn't go up, that is to say, if this supply schedule didn't increase that much because there is upward wage rigidity, then the economy would be, say, in the boom somewhere like here. Yeah, you would have excess demand for labor, so the market would be in disequilibrium. But then if this supply schedule doesn't shift up that much, then in the way down, unemployment would be lower. So having a cap on wage increases during boom would be a good thing to do here. Of course, from a political point of view, it would be a very unpopular policy, right? Because you're saying, okay, the economy is booming, wages want to go up, there is excess demand in labor markets, and the government is not preventing wages to go up. So it would be very unpopular. But from the point of view of addressing this externality that we talked about before, it would be a positive policy.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. I think there are a couple of questions. I will share the questions later on over mail. You can respond them tomorrow when we begin. So where is Chair? Chair Sudhir, you can come up.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Martin, for a fascinating talk. I'm not a macroeconomist, but I could follow at least parts of it. So let me just remind everyone, at 8:30, there's Vijay Krishna's talk. So see you there. Thank you again.
Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow.
And see you tomorrow. Yeah.